Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today for this other event in the KEX seminar series, which is fabulous. So today we're very fortunate to have Lachlan Blackhall presenting. Before I introduce Lachlan, I'll just mention a couple of quick housekeeping notes. I'll just ask participants to mute themselves if they haven't already, just to minimize the background noise. But you don't need to mute your video if you're on a good connection. Feel free to keep it on so that the speaker can feel though they're immersed in amongst their peers and colleagues. So you can certainly keep your video on if you like, it's up to you, but I'll ask you to mute. And then at the end, when we have question time in about 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how long Lachlan goes for, I'll just remind you to unmute before asking a question. Otherwise, we'll hear the most common phrase for 2020 once again. Oh, I didn't realize I was on mute. All right, so look, I'm going to jump into it because Lachlan is the main show today and I'm really excited for this one. I realize we've got a few participants that are outside of the college. So for everyone's interest, I'll give a brief intro on Lachlan. So Associate Professor Lachlan Blackhall is one of very few entrepreneurial fellows at the ANU, appointed by the Vice Chancellor in that role. And he's also the head of the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program, BSGIP, at the ANU. Previously, Lachlan led the development of capabilities to monitor, optimize and control residential solar generation and battery storage, as well as the development of virtual power plant technology to aggregate energy storage. So Lachlan has a very blended background of industry, research, academia, and entrepreneurship. Lachlan has a BE, BSc, and PhD in engineering and applied maths. He's a senior member of IEEE and a fellow of both IE-OST and ATSI. Rather than introduce what Lachlan's going to talk about, I'm going to throw over to Lachlan. I'm going to re-emerge at about 12:40-ish for Q&A, and hopefully we have a lovely discussion. But look, thanks everyone for joining us. What a great way of doing this. Hopefully you all have a cuppa, a coffee, or maybe even a snack to enjoy the presentation. So Lachlan, over to you. I can see your screen, so we're all systems go.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. Look, as I begin, please allow me to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on whom we're meeting today, or many of us are meeting today, which is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in the ACT, and allow me to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present today. I came back to the ANU in April 2018, and I've actually been remiss in not giving a public seminar like this to the college. So I apologise for that, but appreciate the chance to do it today. Given that I haven't actually spoken to the college since I've come back, I would really just like to say thank you to the warm welcome I've had since the time I've been back, and also to thank all the staff within the college, both academic and professional, for the support I've been given personally, but also the support that you've given to our entire team. I feel quite lucky to be in the position to be leading a program like this. And today, I'm hopefully going to be able to give you some insights into a bit of background about the program, what we're doing and what we're all about. Then a brief history lesson as we sort of romp through the last 160 years of the energy and electricity system in Australia, all with a view to actually talk a bit about the work that we're doing within the program itself. So let's dive in, shall we? So the battery storage and grid integration program was kicked off, as I said, in April 2018, and it's a slightly weird program, I suppose, because it's funded by industry dollars that went through the ACT government and have landed at a university, and really that sets the scene for the kind of program that we are. So we're effectively about bringing together industry, academia and government to solve interesting and relevant problems, particularly as relates to the energy space. So our mission is really about designing and implementing the building blocks of a resilient energy system. And importantly, this is for the benefit of all energy users. So it might seem a slight misnomer to be talking about energy system very broadly when the name of the program is the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program. And so while storage plays a really fundamental role in the future of our electricity system, it's not the be all and end all. Ultimately, the goal here is to actually to bring about a future energy system. And so the talk the talk today is really about how we deal with decarbonising our energy system. The result of that will be that it will become highly decentralised, and ultimately that will democratise what to date has actually been a large centralised infrastructure-led system. So within the program itself, we've currently got about 35 staff and students and pursuing projects all over Australia. As I said, we have a strong focus on working with industry, but also a strong focus on actually working with government and regulators and policymakers as well. While I'm an engineer by training, I think one of the things that's really important to realise in very large systems like the energy and electricity system is that ultimately the decisions that we're making and the work that we're doing has a huge impact on people. And so actually, if you start from the perspective that people are at the centre of much of this work, it really allows you to recognise that the social science, the economics, the policy and the regulation all play a really important role in ensuring that particularly some of the technical work that we're doing can actually get out there and have a very positive impact on people. So our work largely falls into 4 key themes, which I'll go through briefly before I dive into some of the specifics. So one of the key themes that we have is a focus on materials and battery technologies and battery characterization. I won't touch on that too much today, except to say that we have a team that sits within the Research School of Chemistry, led by Dr. Alexei Klashenkov, who are pursuing some really interesting work looking at the types of batteries that are going to be post-lithium, so particularly sodium and potassium batteries. Alexei should definitely give a talk in and of his own right about all the work that they're doing. And later this year, there's actually will be a public launch via webinar of the laboratory that Alexei and his team have designed and built. The other themes that we're working on are really looking at how you better model and analyze the electricity system. It often comes as a surprise to many people to realize that we actually don't know that much about the poles and wires that are in the streets that power our home. So we have about 40,000 kilometres of transmission network. They're the big poles and wires that you see as you travel between major capital cities. But we have almost 1 million kilometres of distribution network, and largely the distribution network has been designed to be set and forget. You do your analysis, you do your planning and you build it, and it largely to date has worked as you would hope it would work. And that's been fine until now, because largely consumers have been passive consumers of electricity. But as we start to interconnect more devices into the distribution network in particular, it's become important for us to actually understand how the system behaves and how we can optimize its performance. And so key to that is obviously actually understanding what we have in the distribution network and being able to better model it. Once we have the basis for those models, we're able to do better control, optimization and coordination of all of these assets. And again, as we're moving from hundreds of large generators to potentially millions or tens of millions of small generators, this becomes a really interesting and important problem to solve. And last but not least, as I said, we do a lot of work in the social science, economics and policy space. And we actually have a growing social science team within the program, which is now 4 people, which is fantastic. And through this, we're actually working to better understand what customers actually want. And it's often a shock when you turn up to energy and electricity industry conferences to actually say to people, there's actually 24 million people that sit at the end of this system that we all work in, and that it's actually probably an important time to understand what they want, because ultimately what they want should and can inform the kind of work that we're doing to enable that. So at a high level, they're the 4 themes, and then we obviously have a series of projects, which I'll talk a little bit about as we progress today. So as I said, a little bit of a brief history lesson just to get us started. So this is the Sydney Observatory, and in the 1860s, this was where we had the first electric power in Australia. So it's quite relevant from our perspective, because the first electric power in Australia was actually provided by a battery. So it was provided by an early voltaic pile. And interestingly, the dynamo, or the generator that now powers the majority of the world's electricity systems wasn't actually invented until the 1870s. So when we first got electricity, we didn't actually have the generators that we know and love today. The other interesting thing that's worth noting here is back in the 1860s, when we were using the voltaic pile, this was also the point at which we discovered how we could obtain hydrogen via electrolysis. And so if you go back 160 years, batteries and the ability to actually produce hydrogen were intimately coupled. And now if we think about where our energy system's going in future, batteries and hydrogen are again two of the key capabilities that are going to power our system through the 21st century. So we started with batteries, but pretty soon we had the dynamo, we had the generator, and we started moving towards larger centralized generation. And so this is a picture here of the Araring power station, which is a large black coal-fired power plant on the central coast of New South Wales. So it's interesting for me personally, because this was where my mum started her job in the late 70s. And so at that time, Australia was at the forefront of leading coal-fired generation technology. We just installed some of the largest generation units available, 660 megawatt units. It's really interesting from my perspective to reflect on this, because one generation forward from the work that my mum was doing, and we've realized that there are certain atmospheric chemistry problems that arise from burning lots of fossil fuels. And in Australia, we've actually come to the realization now that we'll never build another coal-fired power plant in Australia. If you look at the roadmap for when coal is going to be removed from the system, we're going to see a massive decline in the amount of coal-fired generation over the years ahead to 2050. So obviously, climate change has been a massive driver to move away from coal-fired and fossil fuel-fired generation broadly. But it's also moving away because the economics of fossil fuel-fired generation have significantly deteriorated. And this has been led by a massive increase in the amount of renewable generation that's entering our system. So anyone who's driven anywhere around the ACT recently would realise the growth that we're seeing both in wind and solar, in solar generation. So wind generation has come down massively in cost, is now under $50 a megawatt hour to install. And the same with solar, which is actually even cheaper again than wind generation. And so our future energy system is really going to be powered by both of these technologies. If we look to the integrated system plan that's been developed by the Australian Energy Market Operator, we can see just how significant the transition is going to be over the next 20 years. So while we have a largely fossil fuel fired power system today, by the time we get to 2040, less than a third of electricity is going to be generated, or less than a third of electricity generation capacity is going to be provided by fossil fuels. We obviously have a significant growth in the amount of wind generation. There's obviously going to be a deployment of significant amount of energy storage. But the real standout in terms of generation is solar. And by 2040, over 50% of our generation capacity will be solar alone, which is a really extraordinary transition when you think about the fact that 15 to 20 years ago, there was very little solar generation in Australia and very little anywhere in the world. So this transition away from fossil fuel generation towards renewable generation is actually is a trend going on everywhere in the world, although Australia is definitely leading that transition. And this kind of gets to the first point I wanted to make in the talk today, and that is this transition to decarbonisation that we're seeing in the world's energy and electricity systems is obviously a very welcome transition, one that I would personally like to see happen much, much faster, but is obviously a really significant change in the way we think about the design and operation of our electricity system. So decarbonisation is underway, and it's definitely going to accelerate through the next decade and all the way to 2050. Alongside the uptake of more renewable generation has been the uptake of residential PV. So Australia is the world leader in the adoption of PV, and it's hard to keep track of how many households now have it on their roof, but it's probably somewhere between 2.4 and 2.5 million households that have adopted it. In some parts of the country, 1 in 3 homes have adopted residential PV, and it's been driven for lots of reasons. But customers, particularly now, are really they're taking up residential PV as a way that they can act, but they can act in response to climate change, but also being driven by the fact that it's just so cost effective to put a few more panels on your roof. So the uptake in solar PV is really driving the other major trend that we're going to see, definitely in Australia's electricity system, but also globally. And that's one of a shift towards decentralisation. So as I said at the start of the talk, there's probably somewhere between 100 to 150 large centralised fossil fuel fired generators in Australia at the moment. And that is we're moving away from that and towards this notion where we have 2.5 million homes today already with solar PV on their roof. So while Australia isn't the leader in decentralisation at the moment, although we're very close, you can see that by 2025, Australia runs away from the rest of the world in having the most decentralised electricity system. And this in and of itself is a really good thing. We're seeing the uptake of consumer interest and consumer action in driving this change. But on the flip side, from a technical and operational perspective, it's creating some new and really interesting challenges about how we're actually going to operate our electricity system into the future. And when you think about moving from hundreds of units to millions or tens of millions of units that need to be orchestrated, you can really start to understand the scale of the problem. So I just sort of wanted to put in context some of the challenges that are being faced. And often people refer to these challenges as being the problems of renewables or the problems of distributed generation. I tend to think of it a slightly different way. There's actually no inherent problems with having an energy system that has a lot of renewable generation, nor one that has a high level of decentralisation. But there is a challenge in trying to operate a 21st century electricity system using a 20th century paradigm. And largely that's the challenge that we run into at the moment. So much of the work that we and others are undertaking within the industry more broadly is to think about how we actually design and build those new capabilities and operating paradigms that will actually give us that 21st century operating paradigm for a 21st century electricity system. So notwithstanding that, some of the things that we have to deal with on the way to getting there are really these challenges around how we better understand and operate our distribution networks. And so I'll talk a little bit about that over the next couple of slides. So when we first designed our distribution network, we imagined that all of the power would be flowing in one direction from these large centralized generators outwards effectively to the edge where it would be consumed by customers. That has really changed when you start to imagine that we have 2.4, 2.5 million households with a large amount of solar. So we're now facing these challenges of how we actually operate a system where you have two-way flows. Now the poles and wires themselves don't actually particularly care which way the electrons are flowing, but many of the protection systems and the operational systems that are in place they just never accommodated, never conceptualized that power would actually be flowing in both directions. So we have a situation where we have these reverse flows, particularly during the day at peak generation, that requires us to rethink how we actually operate the system. We can see in some places, particularly in South Australia and also emerging in Western Australia, this notion that actually if solar PV adoption continues at the current rate, we might actually reach a point within the next decade where during some days of the year, whole states will be exporting to other locations in Australia. And while that is a really great achievement from the perspective of renewable energy generation, if you run the system, this absolutely terrifies you because this is not something you ever thought you would have to manage. And just to highlight sort of some of the challenges that emerge when you arrive at this situation where a whole state is fully exporting into the grid, we have a system that's called under frequency load shedding. And the way that this system works is when we have a frequency drop, we use this system to drop the amount of load. So it's just, we shed load and we use that as a mechanism to recover. When you have your entire state in export, you no longer have any load to shed. And ironically, you could find yourself in a situation where your frequency is dropping. You need to reduce load, which is equivalent to increasing generation. And in response, you would actually shed generation, which would accelerate the instability of the grid. So thinking through what it means to actually have the ability to better manage frequency when you have these periods where the whole state is exporting is a real challenge, and one that the system operator takes very seriously. The other thing that we're seeing within the grid is an increasing dynamic range for voltage. And so within our grid, we have these prescribed limits for voltage. And while being slightly outside of these bounds is largely not hugely problematic, what we're starting to see now is that there's significant deviations outside of the voltage bounds. So we see voltage rise during the day when we have large amounts of solar generation. And we've also already seen voltage drops, which might be, could be explained by water heaters coming on in a synchronized way. As we go forward though, we're going to see significant challenges where we'll have significant generation during the day pushing voltage up, and then everyone's going to come home at night and charge their electric vehicle, and that's going to drag voltage all the way down. And so better managing this dynamic range again, is a key challenge for everybody. So largely this means that we arrive at a situation where we can actually start to define some of the challenges that we're facing. And I'll split this into the technical and the social, because as I said before, these are no longer just technical challenges that we're facing. On the technical front, we tend to refer to the three key challenges as needing to maintain energy reliability, energy security, and network capacity. Now, for those of you who watch what's going on in energy in the media, you would appreciate that energy reliability and energy security get talked about a lot, and very rarely are those terms used correctly. So energy reliability actually is one of the simplest problems you can state, and it simply means that supply and demand have to be in equilibrium, and they have to be in equilibrium at all times and in all geographies. Energy security actually refers to the ability of the power system to recover from a contingency event. So you might lose a generation unit, and particularly thermal generation units are particularly prone to failing during hot summer days, but it could also mean you've lost part of your transmission infrastructure. So while security, often we manage it in a different way, you can kind of think of you can kind of think of energy security as actually just being short-term energy reliability. So supply and demand ultimately need to be in equilibrium always, both on very, very short timescales, which we call energy security, and also on much longer timescales, which are reliability. The other key element to this is you actually need enough capacity in your network. And so you can have as much generation as you want, but if you can't squeeze that generation through the pipes you have a challenge. And particularly when we start to think about the network capacity out in the distribution network, this is an increasingly difficult challenge, both to understand and also to resolve. And it gets harder, particularly when you start to have two-way flows of energy. So there's some of the technical challenges, but we also have really key challenges on the social front. Obviously, customers are starting to buy assets, solar and batteries, which we'll talk about a little more in a minute. And customers have an expectation that power will be affordable, that there will be equitable access to some of these technologies, and particularly equitable access to the benefits of these technologies. And they also want choice. They want to be able to choose to buy one technology over another, or choose not to buy any technologies and still be given a fair go. And as I said before, we've got plenty of technologies, but actually understanding how to deploy them into the grid is an increasingly difficult challenge. So jumping in now to some of the work that we're doing, what you can see on the screen here is a graph of all of the about 1,000 customers who are participating in the ACT Next Gen battery storage program. And on the left-hand side, you can see the demand, where a more yellow color means higher demand. And on the right-hand side, you can see the solar generation. And you can clearly see that there's actually a really significant mismatch between when people are consuming energy which is typically in the mornings and evenings during winter, and when they're generating energy from their solar panels, which is in the middle of the day. And this has really led to the uptake of residential battery storage. Now, I find it quite hard to think of it this way, but many consumers have this real attachment to the electrons that they generate on their roof. And so they want those electrons to be stored in their battery so that they can use them later in the evening. And so when you talk to customers, this drive towards self-sufficiency has been one of the key reasons why battery storage has been taken up. But batteries aren't particularly cheap. And so once you've bought a battery, there's also that tendency then to think about how you could better optimize batteries. And one of the key ways to do that is to think about all of the financial incentives that might be out there. And so you've got your battery and you start to think about what's the most, the optimal way to have these optimized. But there's a whole lot of consumer preferences that also need to be captured in this. When we first deployed some of this technology into the field, I had a customer who called up and said that the algorithms that we had were making his wife sad. And this kind of came as a bit of a shock to me, because my view was that we designed, we were optimizing, so it was clearly optimal in what we were doing. But the realization that actually customer preferences are quite unique and individual and personalized is something that makes it challenging to have a one-size-fits-all solution. And as you move towards having millions of customers who have solar, and potentially millions who will also have batteries, actually working out how you optimize in a way that actually achieves a good outcome for customers, but also a good outcome for the grid becomes increasingly challenging. So one of the things that, one of the technologies that I've been involved in developing is this capability around virtual power plants. And this is, instead of thinking about battery assets just optimizing for themselves, it's thinking about how you can actually aggregate all of that storage to participate in markets. It obviously provides a good financial incentive for customers, but also allows the system operator an easier way to manage all of these individual assets that are out there. Instead of having to think about all of these assets individually, all million or 10 million of them, you can start to think about aggregating them up as large virtual power plants and then bidding them into markets and participating in this way. One of the challenges, though, that comes when you start to aggregate all of these batteries up, and particularly where you start to coordinate them in a way that's quite correlated, is that while you're getting good outcomes for the market, you then might be causing other impacts for the networks itself. And so this was a really interesting graph from my perspective, because this was using some of the technology we had built, and it was optimizing in the way that it should have been optimizing, but it was causing this massive issue for the distribution network in which it was being hosted. And so finding ways where you can optimize what the customer wants to make sure that they're not sad about the algorithms, where you can find a way to maximize the benefits of participating in the market, but at the same time also not burning down the distribution network where it's hosted, kind of typifies the kind of problems that we're facing in designing these new capabilities. So once you start to realize that you need this broader coordination, one of the projects that we kicked off not long after I got to ANU is a project called the Evolve project. And the simplest way to think about the Evolve project is actually to think about how do you, we understand clearly the concepts of managing congestion in our traffic system, starting to think about how we actually better manage congestion within the electricity network is a concept that's really emerging as a solution to the significant uptake, both of generation, but also of other forms of technology like battery storage. And it's going to be increasingly important as not only battery storage uptake increases, but as we head towards a future with a lot of electric vehicles. So in the Evolve project, we're working through, how you better understand hosting capacity, which gets to, how big the pipes are in your network. And we're developing a lot of tools and capabilities around this. So we're also working closely with Sylvie Thierbeau's group, Paul Scott and Dan Gordon, to leverage some of the existing work that they've done on the very successful Bruny Island battery trial. And again, for those of you who aren't aware of that, it's a fantastic project which wound up last year. So through this work, we're actually developing quite a lot of modeling capability and open source tools that we're also not only able to directly solve problems in the distribution network, but also actually being able to put this into the public domain so it can be used by others as well. So we've heard a lot about, I've talked a bit about the opportunities for residential battery storage. Most of you have probably heard about the Tesla big battery, which was installed in South Australia in 2017. But there's also opportunities now for a new class of battery asset, and that's what we would think of as a community or suburb scale battery asset. So community or suburb scale storage is, as you would imagine, installed in communities or in suburbs and grid connected. It can look a little bit like this, which is not particularly attractive in your local suburb or park, but we're talking about shipping container sized battery assets that can be installed. And the reason why we're starting to think about assets like this is that, to be able to have a residential battery, one, you need to be able to afford it. Number two, you need space in your backyard to be able to install it. And so it means that people who are renting, people who live in apartments can't really access the benefits of energy storage. So when you start to go and talk to customers about what they want, they do want access to these capabilities. They do want to be able to benefit from the deployment of storage and this broad transition that's occurring within the grid. And so community batteries fill that nice gap in the middle where people can access some form of virtual storage, even if they don't have the opportunity to install it in their house or can't afford an individual asset for some reason. So one of the key reasons that we've been building this social science research capability within the program has been to actually give us the chance to be able to go out and talk to consumers and to better understand them, better understand what they want. And most of it's actually pretty logical. So Hedda Ranson Cooper and her social science team have been doing some really interesting work in going out and actually asking consumers what they want. And some of the results that come back are quite insightful, although perhaps not unexpected. So it's actually pretty depressing to realise that the trust within the energy sector is actually on par with trust with banks in Australia. So low and getting lower. And so when you actually go out and talk to consumers about what they want, they have very significant concerns around privatisation of the electricity system broadly, but also the role that big retailers are playing within the system. And so when you start to think about putting a battery asset into the community, customers are actually quite concerned about who is going to be controlling the battery and in whose interests it's actually going to be controlled. They're also keen to make sure that benefits actually remain local. If you have a local or community battery, making sure that the benefits actually remain locally is actually reasonably intuitive and clear. So some of the comments that you get from people, and these are all anonymized, so not real names, but real locations, really just show the challenge that we're up against when we start to think about the broader energy transition that's underway. There's very, very low trust in what's going on. There's a very high expectation that customers feel they're going to get screwed through the process of this transition. And none of these are technology problems. So we have all the technology in the world to solve the technical energy transition, but actually making sure we can do it in a context where customers are happy with the outcomes is something that has been underdeveloped in the work that's been done to date, and something that we have to focus on and prioritise in the work that's going forward, not just within battery storage and grid integration program, but also very broadly within the energy sector in Australia. So when we're starting to think about some of these models, we're starting to also think about the fact that, we actually, if you go back 150 years, the first energy models that we built were actually local. They were started by councils. They were about developing local power systems for use in communities. And even though we've gone and built a very large centralised energy system, we're now starting to think about how we can go back to operating our system purely for the benefit of people in a local community. So this concept of actually ensuring that energy remains local really goes to this notion, not only that customers like their own electrons, which again, as I said before, I find a little odd, but it makes perfect sense that, you know, if you want the benefits to remain local, that also comes with it a conceptualization that you want the energy to remain local. So we've got this concept now of thinking about, you know, local flows of energy versus those more remote flows where it flows up into the broader grid. So we then start to think about how we can optimize community batteries and thinking about the potential energy flows that occur locally. And there's some really interesting optimization problems that emerge out of all of this. And I won't dwell on the optimization problems, although for those who are interested, certainly follow up later. But really to think about, again, from a customer perspective, thinking about for whose benefit the battery is controlled is actually really important. And when we're thinking about these local energy models, thinking about whether it's optimized on behalf of the entire community, and that might be people for whom they don't actually have any solar at all, or whether the battery itself is actually optimized purely for the financial benefit of the owner, who may be totally unrelated to the community, are kind of key considerations for us. So I think Nick's probably going to be getting a bit nervous about time, but Nick, just give me a couple more slides and I'll wrap up for questions. So maybe the last project I'll focus on is a project that was recently announced, the REVS project, and that's being led by Dr. Bjorn Sternberg within the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program. I'd certainly encourage you to reach out to him if you'd like any further details. I should note that the community energy work's being led by Marnie Shaw. And again, I know she's always very happy to chat to people about the work that's being done. So within the REVS project, we're looking at the opportunities and the challenges, again, of what happens when you have significant uptake of electric vehicles in the grid. And so it's fair to say we actually don't have much uptake today. So Australia actually trails the OECD average. But the future growth of electric vehicles in Australia and also everywhere else in the world is very significant, and largely being driven by the fact that by the end of this decade and into the 2030s, the overwhelming majority of manufacturers are actually going to stop manufacturing internal combustion engines, and so electric vehicles will be the de facto choice for new cars. So this graph here really shows the projected consumption of electricity, energy broadly, that EVs will be responsible for, but it's a really good proxy for understanding the significant uptake that we're going to see from EVs. So what Bjorn and his team are doing through the REVS project is actually thinking about the opportunities, not just for EVs to consume, but also to export back into the grid. And so where they're starting is actually thinking about the opportunities for fleets of electric vehicles, and in this case, the ACT government's fleet of electric vehicles, to actually deliver key stability services back into the grid and to support energy security. And so if you start to think about the opportunities when you go not just government fleets and not just private fleets, but also EVs owned by the public, you start to understand that actually there is a future where many of the stability services, maybe overwhelmingly all of the stability services that we might need in the grid, could be provided by electric vehicles. And that's obviously a really exciting opportunity for the future. I might stop there, and I'm very happy to take any questions that people might have.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you very much, Lachlan. I'll start off. A lot of people are still on mute, but a bit of a round of applause there so that you feel as though you're in the presence of others. But look, that was extremely interesting and fascinating, both from the technical and the non-technical perspective. All right. Well, look, we have a very big list of participants here, so bear with me. What we're going to do is use the raise hand function. So for those that click on, if you don't know how to do that, you click on participants and you'll see the participants list, and in there's a raise hand function. We already have one, so I'm going to pass over to Kiara. If you just remember to unmute, Kiara, you've got question 1.
Hey Lachlan, I'm curious about this EV cars as the sort of backup energy supply, because that would presumably mean you need to charge the battery in the car at some point and then discharge it back into the grid and that's not a 100% efficient process, like batteries don't charge, discharge wonderfully. Is the current level of efficiency and charge discharge on car batteries enough that they would be able to provide that, or do they need to improve in order to provide this stability?
Well, I mean, you know, as an engineer, more efficiency is always better. That's certainly what I was taught going through, going through my studies. I think perhaps I tend to think of it in another way now, though, and that is that yes, while more efficiency is always better, we're heading towards a future where actually electrons are largely free. They come from the sky, you know, the wind blows and so on. So we're not going to have a shortage of energy. The biggest challenge we're going to have is a mismatch of when we're having energy generated and when we're having energy consumed. And this is the sort of the reliability and security questions. So efficiency, yeah, more efficiency is always better, but with current levels of efficiency, there's absolutely no reason why EV batteries, you know, couldn't provide this service and couldn't provide it at scale. Okay. One of the reason I said right at the start is that even though we're called the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program, we focus a lot on how you operate power systems, is that if there was a future where you didn't need storage for whatever reason, you wouldn't use it because it does introduce inefficiencies into the grid. But actually the bigger challenge we're facing is this mismatch between supply and demand. And so storage, you know, by its nature is going to play a pretty vital role in ensuring that we actually can run the system.
And actually linked to that supply demand mismatch on the graphs you were showing with the pretty colors that I love, the supply obviously from the sun, that's going to stay what the sun is. It's pretty predictable. But the demand, was that just from households? And would that be a different plot if you looked at overall energy consumption that includes like industry? So will you still have that mismatch when you go beyond just household energy needs?
Yeah, it's definitely not as stark once you include sort of industry and, you know, and buildings and so on, commercial buildings. But there's always going to be a mismatch. Because the notion that the sun and the wind are going to blow, you know, shine and blow respectively at precisely the time when you wish to consume an electron is kind of just, it's just fanciful. So there's always a mismatch, but what we aim to do is we want to get as much, we want to deal with as much of that mismatch through diversity. So diversity of different types of generation, geographic diversity. We're quite lucky. We have a large country over which to achieve that. And then use storage to largely deal with whatever's left in that mismatch.
Yeah, good points. Geography is definitely a factor. So thanks, Chiara. I'm going to go over now to Brian Anderson. Hi, Brian. I think you're on mute, Brian. No, he's...
Yes, is that better?
That's better. You got it. Thanks.
Lachlan, I'd like to ask a question about the mismatch between supply and demand, or actually a pair of questions.
Yep.
I've read about the possibility of a cable going in from Northern Australia to Singapore, and there's other countries in between. So I'm wondering if is that a realistic way to deal with at least some of the mismatch? And also, you didn't really talk much about hydrogen, but I could imagine that at solar collection points, one could generate a lot of hydrogen, and I would imagine that hydrogen would be better than batteries for trucks and trains and aeroplanes and ships. So does the generation of hydrogen help you solve this oversupply problem?
Absolutely. All right, let's start with the first one. So the cable to Singapore, there's been plenty of proposals, absolutely quite feasible. So high voltage DC, you know, under the ocean, sort of really technically not a problem. You've got to find the money to fund it, but they seem to have found that funding to do so. It won't solve our supply and demand issues too much, because the way we're thinking about it is parking a lot of generation in Northern Australia and then fully exporting that. So it'll definitely help Singapore solve their supply and demand issues. Perhaps to talk to the sort of the broader challenge here is there also then becomes challenges for national security when you start to think about relying solely on another country for energy. And so technically, yes, we'll be able to achieve it, but then for countries who are the recipients of that energy, they also are starting to think through how they diversify their generation sources so that they don't end up in a situation where somebody could flick the switch on this side and they would have an energy dilemma. To the hydrogen question, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tend to think of there's no silver bullet to solving the energy and electricity challenges that we're facing, and largely we're going to need a portfolio of different technologies. We're definitely not going to have fully electric planes in terms of international travel anytime soon, but electric planes for regional travel that are based on batteries are quite feasible, and Norway is kind of leading the charge on that. For long haul trucking and things like that, hydrogen makes perfect sense. It does raise the question around efficiency though, because hydrogen, the electricity to hydrogen, particularly back to electricity, efficiency is quite low. But again, if you're not worried about energy and you're worried about the supply and demand of power, then again, hydrogen plays a really important role in this. And I know Fiona Beck's on the webinar, and she's one of our local experts on that front.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm not going to pass to Fiona because we have a nice, long, healthy list of questions coming at the moment, including a funny comment from Tom, which I picked up, but we'll stick to the question. So look, I think the next hand, it was either Niraj or Dwayne. I'll go to Niraj first, then Dwayne. So Nij, go for it.
Sure. Thanks, Nick. Great to talk, Lachlan. Keen to hear your thoughts on the tension between individual ownership of batteries and solar panels and community participation. So one of the reasons for having a panel or a battery is to be more resilient, or tell the retailers where to go. But as the participation and penetration increases, there's a growing need for greater control or curtailment of the DE asset. And I was wondering keen to hear your thoughts on managing that tension as the transition goes forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the key reasons why people are buying, batteries is to be self-sufficient. And so having a local source of, being locally self-sufficient from your own solar is one thing, but actually being able to, have backup power in the case of, blackouts and things like that is really, is a really important reason why people also buy storage. So there's going to always be people who want storage in their home, but there's plenty of people that won't be able to have it. So as I said, people who can't afford $15,000 outlay, people who don't own their own homes. And I think that's really the case for why you would want other community assets out there as well. It's about increasing the equity of access to storage within the grid. It probably goes back slightly to the answer I gave to Brian, which is actually we're going to see a diversity of different types of technologies and different capabilities at every scale through the system, because the transition we're talking about is overwhelmingly large in lots of cases. So I think, the equity, for equity reasons, definitely, slightly bigger assets than residential storage makes sense. It probably makes the coordination issue slightly easier, because instead of having, each medium scale community asset, community battery is probably, would replace 100 to 500 residential batteries. So it might slightly reduce the scale of the coordination that you need, but again, it's still a really significant coordination issue. So there's probably no reason why you would favour community assets exclusively over residential assets in that case.
Thanks.
Sorry, I was on mute there. I did it to myself. Thanks, Lachlan, and thanks, Niraj, for that question. So Dwayne, I'll pass over to you.
Right, thank you. Just thinking about any industry where any competitive action invites a reaction, and there's going to be winners and losers out of this movement. What are you seeing as reactions from people like alternative power suppliers, say coal companies, big users who may have been subsidised in the past, say aluminium manufacturers, the network owners and operators who have paid a lot of money to buy into this industry themselves, and even things like government? Are they broadly in line? Are they putting roadblocks up? What are you seeing as a competitive environment for that market?
Yeah, it's probably not a great time to be a coal generator, I would argue, and many of them are sort of, their reactions actually are largely being driven by economics, which is to recognise that it's becoming increasingly uneconomic to operate coal-fired power plants. So, you know, many are sort of diversifying into also owning renewable assets, diversifying into owning storage assets because they're quite valuable in terms of the market participation. But it's, you know, it's pretty clear that we're not going to have a large number of coal-fired generators 20, 30 years from now. So I'd say you know, if you go back a few years, there was pushback against that, but now there's just acceptance, I think, from that particular sector that they have to transition. And so they're going to do it the way, you know, they're going to use their incumbency to buy the next tranche of assets that they need to participate. Networks, governments are not, you know, they're not opposing these, you know, the broad transitions underway. You might look at individual governments who, you know, would be helpful if they had slightly better policies than they have today. But I'd say this, you know, the state governments in particular, and particularly the state government in the ACT, is doing an extraordinary job of actually incentivising the, you know, the broader transition. The discussion around networks is an interesting one, but networks they've accepted that, you know, that this transition is going to happen again. And so actually in the distribution networks case, they become increasingly more important because the majority of generation assets, well, the majority of, you know, a significant amount of generation assets are going to be hosted in their networks. And so they kind of become the electricity superhighway. And so they stand to also benefit from this transition. It will change how they operate, but they're certainly not throwing up huge roadblocks. So I actually would say, for all the negativity we sometimes hear in media, actually what's happening on the ground is largely positive. And I think there's a recognition that it's going to happen, and now we just have to try and make it happen in the most efficient way we can.
Thanks, Lachlan. Tom, over to you, Tom Worthington.
Okay, I'll just turn my camera on. Hope it works. I was in the ANU office yesterday for first time in months, and the Dean was muttering something about the chief scientist and gas. So I've read the news report. There's some controversy about, do we need gas-fired power either as an interim on our way to a renewable future, or even then as a backup? I'm just wondering what your view is here. Will we have enough battery storage and enough pumped hydro and enough adjustment of people's motivations for using energy to not need gas-fired power?
Well, one doesn't like to disagree with the chief scientist, but I will. Gas to me is not a requirement to transition. I think we've got the technologies in renewable generation. We've got, you know, we understand what's required from storage. And I mean, I've focused today a lot on the battery side of things, but, you know, obviously pumped hydro is another really crucial piece in the puzzle here. You know, gas is it's problematic for lots of reasons. You know, it's not particularly low emissions. That's a bit of a myth. If you look at the full emissions from wellhead to electricity generation, the methane that escapes is very problematic because it's as a greenhouse gas. So no, I think we could have we can have our energy transition and not use any new gas in particular. So I would, you know, particularly at the moment where there's talking about this gas-led economic recovery, I would much prefer to have a sort of a renewable and storage-led economic recovery. I think that would make a lot more sense. It'd also improve resilience more broadly within the grid, particularly if we started to look at the opportunities for sort of community scale storage and things like that.
Thanks, Lachlan.
Thank you. We might charge ahead.
Yeah, I'll charge ahead. We have two more questions. I'll see if we can get 2 minutes each in those from Go to Woe, because we have 4 minutes to go. Durrani, I'll swing over to you. Durrani.
Hi, my question is there any concern from the customers or from the government, are there any government initiatives to think about how to repurpose the batteries once their lifetime is reached?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not as much focus on it as there should be. I think there's an emerging understanding of the scale that we're going to have around not only repurposing but also recycling. really interesting company in Melbourne called Electrify, who are looking specifically at repurposing out of EVs into stationary storage. And I know Alexi over in chemistry is looking at some of the challenges around recycling. But no, it's a massive opportunity for Australia to actually become experts in that area, because it's going to be a really significant problem in future.
Yeah, because we cannot completely rely on the geography that it will be filled with land with all the electric waste or from the batteries, e-waste and all that stuff.
Oh, it'd be a terrible outcome for us to go down that path. The other thing that's just very quickly, the other thing that's happening is people are starting to think about designing batteries for recycling as well. And so, trying to make the chemistry simpler so that you actually have an easier path to recycle at the end of the lifetime.
Okay, thank you.
And lucky last, Chris Dennis.
G'day, Lachlan.
G'day.
I was wondering if, it seems to me that part of this push towards, community generation and keeping people's electrons to themselves kind of thing has been caused by this distrust in the retailers and the networks, and some of that distrust is obviously warranted, but is there work that can be done in that area in terms of like cleaning up the industry and incentivizing, these providers and the networks to go down certain paths or behave a certain way, and in trying to improve consumer trust? Does that open up other avenues other than sort of this push towards community generation?
Yeah, look, it's actually, the lack of trust is a huge issue, because it gets in the way of constructive conversations around how we move forward. But actually, customers really just want to be heard and spoken to. And so, as I said before, one of the reasons we've gone down the path of having a really strong social science team is, it's really funny. If you go and ask customers what they want, they're pretty straight up and down about telling you. And oftentimes, that doesn't mean that we won't have the technology. It just means it's going to be provided to customers in a form that meets their expectations as well. And so, I think actually just an increasing realization, which is emerging, but it's not fully there yet, that before you plan to roll out an expensive technology solution, you actually should just go and ask people, and then collectively you can agree on a path forward. And I have no concerns that asking customers would mean we wouldn't have an energy transition. It'll actually, for the legwork that will be put in to have those consultations with customers, will get paid back hugely by being able to actually then accelerate through the transition in using technologies, using capabilities that actually customers are quite happy to have.
Excellent. Look, Lachlan and everyone, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut it off there because we've hit time. There's still a few questions that were coming to me through the chat. So I encourage all of you, now that you know who Lachlan is, to reach out to Lachlan. You can ambush him on Teams, I'm sure, at some point, or if you see him around campus when the situation improves, feel free to ask. But look, thanks to everyone. A big thanks to you, Lachlan, for taking the time and the effort, and for everyone for joining us today. Another exceptional KEC seminar. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day and keep the dialogue going. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.